All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this week's spring seminar by the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Siri Shalazi. I'm a senior researcher at WAP, and we're thrilled to present the seminar series this spring based on Iris Bennett's and my new book, Make Work Fair. Each week, we feature different researchers presenting their work, often based on randomized controlled trials, around what actually works to make the workplace more fair. And today, I am beyond thrilled to introduce a dear friend and colleague and a brilliant collaborator, Oliver Hauser, who's joining us from Exeter University in the UK, where he is a professor of economics, as well as the deputy director of the Institute for Data Science and AI. Oliver has held fellowships at the Alan Turing Institute as well as at Harvard. He was, in fact, a former fellow at the Women in Public Policy program, as well as my office mate for one semester. And Oliver has also taught at both Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Business School. And most recently, he has been appointed as senior advisor to the UK Cabinet Office, which is particularly exciting. Feel free to ask him questions in the Q&A about that. So today, Oliver will be presenting his research related to chapters 7 and 8, in case you're following along in the book. So we're talking about screening of applicants and hiring of applicants, making concrete hiring decisions. So we'll have Oliver present for about 30 to 40 minutes. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function throughout the presentation, and then I'll ask Oliver those questions at the end. So Oliver, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Siri. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the very kind introduction. It's wonderful to be back at WAP, and if virtually, but it's wonderful to have so many of you join today, and of course the opportunity to share some of our research with you. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and hopefully this goes as planned. If not, I'm expecting Siri or someone else to mention it. But
Looks
today
perfect.
I'm going to Perfect. Thank you, Siri. All right. So thank you very much again, Siri, also for the kind introduction. Like Siri mentioned, I'm at the University of Exeter, where I have a bunch of different roles. I'm in the cabinet office, and I'm still keeping some affiliation with Harvard, which has been very nice over the years, an opportunity to come back, learn from the wonderful community, and give back. I'm also, before jumping straight into my presentation, want to thank both my university for funding, but also the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship, which has been has been making it possible for me to have time for a lot of research, and a lot of these RCTs that I'm showing you today are funded through that. With that in mind, I thought I'd jump straight into how to reduce bias and discrimination in hiring, evidence from randomized controlled trials. I think for the audience here, it's not going to be necessary to do much of an introduction of why we think fairness in the workplace is important. If you have been reading Siri and Iris's book, they make a wonderful case for why this is important, and also how it's important still today, given the political uncertainty, that many organizations are still aiming to achieve some version of equality, diversity, inclusion, and that's maybe changing. But what isn't changing, I think, is that lots of organizations and individuals really care about a fair process and fair outcomes. And that's been something that's been established for a long time, that's been highly desired in various ways you could measure that. And the way we often think about this, and by we, I mean, I'm very collectively speaking here about Siri, Iris's, and my work, because we've had a lot of overlap in the years, but obviously both of their, Iris's first book and their book now is a wonderful way to think about achieving this by designing fair and unbiased processes in the organizations that we lead. So with that in mind, I thought about how do we best illustrate where we actually start when we think about fixing some of these problems. So the way you think about many of these organizational processes is probably that there's a pipeline that starts at the very far left here with applications from individuals. And in the best case scenario, we have this pipeline be full with water, always smoothly running all the way to the end, and the best talent, which represented by this strong pressure of water running through this pipeline into this cup of water at the end. If this worked really well, we would be very happy, and we would hopefully consider that at each point where, of course, there's some selection going on, hopefully we've done a good job and have made it fair. However, in the real world, we still know that there's a lot of underrepresented groups that are not making it all the way to the top of this organization, illustrated by this pipeline. And so there's actually a leaky pipeline. And this is the problem that we're trying to address here. My research among the kinds of different research streams that I pursue has done lots of work at each of these points, but I like visualizing like this because you can start focusing on a problem and start thinking about how do we address this particular point in time in the organization's life. So today I'm going to talk about the first two bits, which is applications and shortlisting. But before we get into the actual work that I've done, it's worth pausing for a moment and thinking about what could lead to some of this leakiness and some of the unbalanced outcomes in the end. In particular, if you look at, say, what I'm representing here, senior leadership or executives, the blue could be women in executive positions are still very few. If you look at a Fortune 500, for instance. And so in the question often comes down to, can we parse out some of these elements that are responsible for this? Of course, we have to start with one particular element of it, which goes in economics down to preferences and how people decide they want to do something or not. It could be that part of the reason why we're seeing fewer women, let's say, in senior leadership positions, maybe that they have different preferences for competition. That has been put forward as a potential reason. There's lots of studies out this looking at this in particular, but we're not going to look at this today. So that's one reason. Another reason might be that actually there may not be any differences, but people think there are differences about how men and women ought to behave. So stereotypes come to mind, right? Belief gender differences, even when they're not real. When people have those beliefs, they might act on those beliefs and, for instance, not hire women because they think that they are not as interested in a competitive environment, for instance, or men in a cooperative environment. So some of the work I've been doing with collaborators, Christine Exley at Michigan and previously at Harvard, me and two former students, we were looking at exactly that question, like what are the beliefs that people have about men and women, especially when it comes to generosity, cooperativeness, and how that links to the workplace and how that might also lead to suboptimal outcomes, both for men and women. So that's also not what we're going to talk about today. Today, I'm going to focus on the bit that you've probably been thinking about, presumably in your work quite a bit if you're working in this space, is that bias and discrimination still play a role in some of these processes, and sometimes to the extent that they can shift the outcomes that we really want to achieve. And so the question is, how do we intervene at the first 2 points here to fix the leaks? In one of the roles that I have at Exeter through the UKI Fellowship, I'm leading the Big Ideas initiative that is trying to address exactly that. Today, I'm going to tell you about 2 papers we've written. The first one focuses on applications. And this is trying to address the employment gap, or sometimes also called the maternity leave penalty, when people take some time out of their job, for instance, for care responsibilities or many other reasons it could be, and then apply to a job, they find that they're less often hired. So we have done some work in trying to address that part of the problem. I'll tell you a bit more about how we have done that. The second paper we're looking at is a way to try and reimagine diversity training. Something that's been a lot in the news lately. I think for us, it's obviously a very interesting time to be talking about this, but we're also particularly excited that we found something that works quite effectively in a large organization. And that's what I'm going to share with you today as well. If you're interested in any of the details, these papers obviously are on my website and Sierra and Iris as well. So with that in mind, I thought I would sort of stop for a minute and maybe going back to this slide one more time, just to say that often at these points in time, you could look at this problem, the one problem, let's say around applications, the one problem around shortlisting and hiring or evaluation, promotion, reapplication, succession planning, or the senior leadership appointments. You can look at them often from 2 sides, the supply side and the demand side of labor. The supply side are applicants, right? So people who put in their CVs and they want to get hired at a firm, or put their CV and their promotion materials forward because they want to get promoted. On the demand side, you have employers. So the employers are thinking about how do we find the best fit, and ideally, in the best world possible, we have a smooth supply of very talented people, so the best, most talented individuals put themselves forward. The employer is perfectly aware of that and makes it very smoothly possible to pick the talent and moves it up the organizational hierarchy, right? If all of these things go well, starting with an educational equal outcome for men and women through the organizational pipeline, we should expect things to go well. Now, we know that's not always the case. And so the question is, where do we start in trying to fix some of these problems? A lot of the attention that we often pay to in my research and maybe related in my group of collaborators is that we focus on the employer. because we think there's still quite a few things that we need to do to try and fix sort of the leaky pipeline that I mentioned before, potentially discrimination or just unconscious bias in the process. However, I kind of want to stop here and say that we should also sometimes think about how we can help the applicants and give them something they can do to overcome some of the hurdles they might be facing. So while in an ideal world, we want to often think systematically and system level, trying to change things to make them fair for everybody, my first study is going to talk about what applicants to themselves can do to try and overcome what potentially could be a discrimination against them. In the second study, we're going to switch over and we're going to look at employers. So starting with applicants. The employment penalty. So one of the things that you may or may not know, it's something that's been talked about in the past quite frequently and has come up recently as well. Often these conversations come up when we look at the gender pay gap, because maternity leave is still one of the big questions around, how do we make sure that women don't get penalized over their career when they take time out of work? Very, very concretely, there's something that's been well established is that people, usually any applicant, male or female, it depends a bit on context often, but there are often employment gaps on people's CVs, and those applicants with those employment gaps are often passed over in the initial screening process. So they submit their CV, and while they might be very qualified on paper, having that employment gap means that they're less likely to receive a callback or an interview. That links to what I just said about maternity leave, because as you may know, especially in Europe, if you're tuning in from Europe, where we have very extended maternity leave packages and support, women do take time out of work for a longer period of time, which is often very good. What we in society have often, at least in Europe, seen as something we wanted, men and women ideally, take time out of work to look after their children when they're young. That's sort of a societal preference, which is not necessarily held in the US to the same extent, where there isn't as much protection, even if individuals might want to do that. But if you have that in place, the longer people are outside the job, the bigger the gap gets. And so studies have found that makes it pretty hard for women often to come back into the workforce. But I also want to say that this has become a problem that isn't just limited to gender these days anymore. And when we ran this study, actually, it was the first bit of the study was done before COVID, but the second bit we ran additional studies online during COVID, and it really occurred to us just how common this will be for many people now, especially during COVID. Lots of people lost their jobs temporarily, and we didn't actually know at the time, well, what effect would that have when people go out into the job market? So one of the things that you could come up with, and is actually very widely advertised, is this idea to just talk about it, explain the gap. The CV can tell you many things as an employer, right? You know who's applying. Why don't the applicants just write to say, I took out time to look after my children? It's called Explain the Gap. If you Google this, there's lots of online forum advice. There's also web pages dedicated to it. It begs the question, is that a good idea? Should you explain the gap? I took this screenshot actually today. I wanted to look and see if I can find a really nice example of this, and I did very quickly. If you just Google it, and the reason I picked this one, not because its image quality is unfortunately not very good, but because it directly inserted this line that said, "Make sure to address a career break directly." Put up at the top, right? Just say you took some time out, you had a child, and in particular, what I find interesting, which is not something we tested, by the way, but I noticed today, is it actually did say that someone said, I did complete 5 freelance projects for my former employer, or achieved certification in this and that. So in this particular case, this website wasn't just advertising saying the first line, which is saying, taking a 1-year break to look after my child. They say you should also add some additional things. Now, the reason I like this as an example is because it's so widespread. This idea that you should explain the gap. This was our starting point when we started this project, to think about, is this one good strategy? Is that the one you should be using? This led us to run a series of studies, the first one being by far the biggest and most important, which is a field experiment and randomized control trial in the UK, where we varied what we wrote on different CVs. And we sent these out to over 9,000 employers. And I'll tell you a bit more about how we worked to hand this out. And then we tested the callback rate. How often did people call back? And then we had some additional lab and online experiments. This is jointly done with my wonderful collaborators, Ariella Crystal, who's at UCLA, Leonie Nix, who's at the Behavioral Insights team, and Jamie Glure at St. Gallen. And basically, if you haven't heard about an audit experiment, so as a quick summary, it's basically a form of a field experiment where we send out fictional resumes to real employers. So these employers will receive resumes that look like they come from someone who wants to have this job. And we are measuring whether, depending on what we write on these CVs, people call back either in an email, actual phone number, or just request more information from this particular applicant. And that's called a callback in the literature. And the assumption is that if we keep everything about the CVs constant, except varying some demographic information, like is it a man or a woman, for instance, white or black, then we might find out whether there's implicit or explicit discrimination in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere. It's often been used to detect discrimination. However, in this study, and credit goes to Leonie for figuring this out, we also thought it would be great to test an intervention that way. What if we represented resumes identically, but we varied how we represented some information on those resumes to see whether we can overcome some of the previously studied discrimination findings against certain groups? In case you're interested in more technical parts, when we ran this order experiment, we control for a bunch of things. And the way we did this is we stratified it by different kinds of jobs, whether they were female or male typed, so more male dominated or female dominated, whether low skill and high skill, and full-time or part-time in the experimental sense. So we made sure that this doesn't explain our effect. The outcome, as I mentioned, is what we call the callback rate. And it's usually an interview, but it could also just be an email requesting more information from the applicant, sort of showing interest as an employer. So we tracked all of this, and we found out what works and what doesn't. Now, of course, you don't know the intervention yet. So I'm going to tell you the key elements of this study first, and I'm going to zoom out and tell you a bit more about what else we did. But a key element of this is it's surprisingly simple. You're looking at one of our example resumes that we sent out, Sarah Smith, common names, all of these things were controlled for and taken from either previous papers that have tested these or where we knew that they would signal the right age, for instance. So we piloted this and we tested to make sure that this is a woman in this case. In the first study, they were all female resumes. And we checked whether they would, be perceived as around 30 years of age, which Sarah came out as one of those names that was very popular. So this was run in 2019, so a few years ago now. And you can see there's work experience here, two jobs that she held. And maybe most notably, if this was run in 2019, you can see that the most recent job was from 2013 to 17, which leaves about a 2-year gap between when this person had a last job and when employers started to receive those resumes. This is our control CV. And we call it the dates format often. And you'll see why now. Our treatment CV kept everything constant. Same name, same statement at the top. But as you go down here, while the work experience section is almost identical and the amount of words we've written here and all the same words are there, one thing is different, and it's right here. It says 4 years and 5 years. So if you look here, if you added this up, it's about 5 years. And if you added this up, it's 4 years. So that was really all the intervention is. If you want to zoom in a little bit more, that's really it. So you can have the whole CV in front of you. The only differences were, how do we talk about the work experience? Now we did a little bit more. Like I said, I wanted to focus first on these two conditions, what we call the unexplained gap with dates, or the intervention with years, right? So that was the two I just showed you. Just for completeness, we had one without a gap. So the dates were moved up to 2019 in this case, right? That the job, so all of the dates shifted, not just the last date, but all of these things were shifted. So it was still 4 years of experience here and 5 years here, but the date shifted up 2 years. That's our no gap control condition. And we also had an explained gap. That's the one, going back to what I said before, that simply said something along the lines of, I took out 2 years to look after my newborn, my child, and then came back. Or now I'm coming back into work. All right, so let's jump into the results. Looking at this slide, I'm going to explain the axis first. So on the bottom, you can see our different interventions, the so-called years intervention, no gap, explained gap, and unexplained gap, which I'm going to sort of use as our baseline here, benchmark. You can see here that you have your callback rate. In our experiment, in this case, just over 30% of people resumes led to some sort of callback, email or phone call. Now let's see what happens next. Our years intervention did really well. It was highly successful. It actually shifted up nearly to 40%, which is excellent news. So let me just check what the number is here. So I see it's right, a bit under, so more like 37%. But significantly different from our control condition, the unexplained gap, which is probably the one that people often use, but they might also use the explained gap, and we found it made no difference. There's no difference between the explained gap and the unexplained gap, and also our intervention was more significantly more successful than the explained gap. And finally, the no gap, unsurprisingly, did a bit better than having a gap. But to be fair, maybe most surprising to us was that the years intervention still did better than the no gap intervention. We didn't go in thinking that. And it took us some time to figure out why that is. So first of all, I want to note two things. The years intervention did significantly better than having a gap explained or unexplained. It also did better than the no gap intervention. So we followed up with a few online experiments to test the mechanism behind this. And what we came back realizing is that people, our evaluators in this case, right, we might have employer panels that look through CVs, but in our online studies, we had these evaluators when we said, how hireable is this person? They thought that the years interventions, so applicants with the years format, had more experience. This had nothing to do with their numeric ability, so they could all recall correctly or incorrectly. The same percent of people did the math right. They also didn't have a recall error. They didn't think it was easier or novel necessarily to see this format. They just thought it looked like this person had the experience they needed. And so it could explain, at least partially, why we see a bigger effect in the years than a no gap condition. It turns out those numbers we put, the dates we put on CVs, aren't that straightforward for reviewers and recruiters to really process. They see the numbers, but apparently they don't process and turn them into work experience in the same way. So it turns out actually the years intervention is so good. You could probably write your CV like that, whether or not you are, concerned about this kind of gap, whether or not you have it. And we went a step further, and we actually tested in this new online environment. We also had male CVs, not just female ones, and it works for men and women equally. So what turned out to be an intervention to help, in particular, women coming back from maternity leave to overcome a potential discrimination they might face in the field, it turned out into an intervention that actually works really well for everybody. And it's probably kind of the preferred one because it turns out people who are looking to hire someone care about the experience you have, not about the date, and not really about whether you have a gap on your CV. All right, so that was our first study on the supply side, you might say, giving people a way to make sure they're well prepared and overcome potential discrimination in the job market. Now let's switch over to the demand side and look at employers. In the second study, I'm going to introduce what needs no introduction right now, certainly not in the US, because it's been very much in the news. And this is unconscious bias training or diversity training. Before Trump, they were certainly a very popular approach by many organizations. I completely realize that's changing right now for obvious reasons. There's a lot of uncertainty how organizations will manage that going forward. But needless to say, diversity and unconscious bias workshops or trainings have been around a long time. They have been studied quite extensively and actually have not been found to be very successful at all at changing actual behavior. We've found, and other people have found actually that they change attitudes, sometimes reliably. So people feel like they understand more about the subject matter and discrimination and bias, but it hasn't translated into more diversity in the hiring or promotions that people do. So with that in mind, obviously, people have sort of turned away a little bit from unconscious bias workshops or haven't really seen them as successful as they should be, but they were still doing a lot of that. Now, the question is, of course, should we have retired them altogether, these diversity trainings or unconscious bias trainings? And I think there's some value to be had in them for sure, because we, as I'm going to tell you, we actually find it works to increase diversity, but also employers, at least in Europe and elsewhere, are still keen to make sure that they are taking advantage of the entire talent pool. So to the extent that they can shift it using a lever that is well understood or at least well known, it might be a very successful one. But the problem, of course, going back to what I said, is that traditional diversity training didn't actually change behavior. So this is where we came in. This is actually joint work with Iris and Siri. And so one of the things I'm going to tell you a bit about first is the study context. Really a big, both thank you and wonderful working together with Siri and Iris, Edward, who's also at the Harvard Business School, and my postdoc Johnson Arslan, who's at Exeter. and our wonderful collaborators in More Than Now, which is a behavioral science consultancy, Catherine Wright and James Alpha. So this team together, we came up with a study design, and we worked together with an excellent pioneering field partner, a global communications and engineering firm that was willing to really test and use a scientific approach to testing using a randomized controlled trial to test what actually works on diversity training. This led us collectively to co-design and co-create a new diversity training. And I'm going to point out one thing, which is quite important, that we worked with senior people in the organization, and we timed when we sent out these resumes before the resume sift. I'll tell you a bit more about the differences between the two, but I want to sort of point out that these were new trainings that were developed, fairly short ones, and we also not just changed the content, which I'll tell you about, but also the timing of it. This was sent out as a link to a video in an email to the hiring managers. So since I just mentioned that obviously there's some controversy in the US in particular around diversity training, let me just say that we at least think there's still a particular benefit to doing diversity training well. So the traditional one that we've previously found, or other people have found not to work well, are the ones that have very generic content. So they don't really feel like they're talking about this particular organizations or ties it in with the values of the organization. They're not really often tied to decision context. They tell you a lot about how humans sort of operate, but not really why it affects or how it might affect in your particular decision, that particular outcome. Unfortunately, also the timing, that's what I mentioned before, may be off. So in particular, at least in a lot of organizations I've worked in, when you arrive at a new organization, they'll make you take a training like that. And they'll say, sit through this training half a day or a day, and then checkbox done, right? So you forget about it again until you may have to do a refresher a couple of years later. But in reality, you're probably not thinking about this. This is not front of mind when you actually do sit in a panel or look through CVs and you think about who are we going to hire for this organization. It's too far away, distant in the temporal dimension. And lastly, a lot of diversity training is delivered by outsiders. HS is a big industry, so there are people who have professionalized this, coming in and deliver this for the organization. Either they are doing this in person or there's videos, and often they are outsiders, right? Nothing wrong with that, except that it's often clearly somebody coming into the organization. So we thought there's many things we could change about this, and we call it behaviorally designed training. We changed a few things. We made it tailored, company specific, so led by the values of the company in designing the content. It was specific to one decision. Going back to what I said about the leaky pipeline, it really pays off to pay attention to when do people make decisions and focus on that point. In our case, it was hiring. But you could imagine a similar diversity training being designed and sent to people right before the decision that matters. And that decision could be performance reviews or promotions, all the things that really lead to consequential outcomes. Which brings me to the point about people having to complete these, or were asked to complete these just before the point of decision. And lastly, we worked very closely with the company to have their leaders involved, right? We had someone very senior, two senior people actually, and then somebody who's sort of working on the front line of the HR recruiting function. And so that probably felt much more real to people, that this was happening in their organization, and to some extent also authority figures. And we know that matters too. All right, so how do we do this? We took, before launching the study, we took the sort of universe of managers we had, which is about 7,500 across this company, and we randomly assigned them to one of three conditions: the control condition, which didn't get a video at all; the treatment condition one, which was an effective hiring video. I'll tell you in a minute how that looked different. And then the treatment two, the diversity hiring video. Now, you might wonder why we had two videos here. Just to explain that going in, we obviously thought about diversity training front of mind, but we also wanted to be just honest about the fact that there has been a lot of failed findings, so to speak, like no effect of diversity training. So we thought, why don't we try and isolate the diversity element from a lot of other things that might be doing some work here around effective teamwork and bringing together different people, but not focusing on diversity. So the effective hiring video is similar in length, in content. It just doesn't mention diversity of any kind in that regard. So we're trying to tease out a little bit like what are the kinds of other elements that could be working in the direction of maybe hiring more diversely. So we had two videos that were randomly assigned to people. The outcomes we're looking at is whether a candidate from a traditionally underrepresented background gets hired. Who is this group of underrepresented groups? Well, it was a bit driven by the availability of data. We had gender, but the gender that's recorded in this organization is only binary. So we cannot say anything about non-binary gender. We thought we might have ethnicity, ended up we didn't, and that's partly because the organization is not allowed, and this is true for most organizations. In some countries, it's not allowed to collect ethnicity. In others, it's mandated, but in others, it's not. So the availability of data was too low for us to actually use, and we didn't get that data to look at. But we were talking to the organization, and the closest they had, and one group that they were particularly interested in was so-called non-nationals. This organization is headquartered in Europe and traditionally has found that they hire a lot of people from Europe, and they wanted to make sure that people from other nationalities would also be likely to be or be treated fairly and equally in that regard. And so they call this non-nationals, was one of their targets and one of the underrepresented groups. And lastly, when you put these two together, another group of interest was female non-national applicants. So with that in mind, we looked at over 360,000 candidates who applied to about 13,000 vacancies across 110 countries. And remember, the hiring managers were randomly assigned to one of these three conditions. Which brings me to our results. So again, orientating you on this graph, you're going to see three colors, the non-treatment control, which is our no video control, the effectiveness training, and the diversity training. And on the y-axis here, you'll see the likelihood of being shortlisted or hired. We pre-registered both of these outcomes because we thought it was interesting to look at whether there was any drop-off in particular going from shortlisting to hiring. So what do we find for women? First, we find that in the left hand here, where you have these three bars, so this is our control group, right? The no treatment control, this is our effectiveness training, and this is our diversity training. This leads to a significant difference of about 12% increase in women being shortlisted. There is a small increase here in women being hired, but it's right at the boundary of being significant at the 10% level. And we want to be conservative here, so we're not claiming that this worked for women as well as you might see later for other demographics. But we think it's very encouraging. It still led clearly to more shortlisting. It led a bit of an uptick here. With a bigger sample, maybe we would have seen a significant effect. But moving on from female applicants to our next group, which is non-national applicants, you start seeing a similar pattern again. So in this case, again, this is our control group. This led to an increase, significant increase in shortlisting, and also a significant increase of about 20% relative to the control of non-nationals being hired. So that's quite a substantial effect, actually. I mean, these are obviously relative increases, just to say, not percentage points, which are much, much smaller, as you can see. But for us, at least, it's really important to focus on both elements. Then percentage points, which may look small initially, if you say 1 or 2 percentage points, but in reality, these are real lives. These are people who are getting hired now that wouldn't have got hired otherwise. And obviously, the 20% is relative to the baseline here, right? So one thing to note here and here is shortlisting has more people listed on them. Obviously, a shortlist has multiple people. Hiring obviously has fewer people that get hired. Same for in both for women and for non-nationals. So that's why you see this drop off here. And finally, we're looking at female non-national applicants. The number one thing you will notice immediately was that there's a big drop down here, right? So here you can see that all of these bars are much lower than the bars from, say, women or non-nationals alone. So they have fewer applicants to start with female non-nationals. But the good news is it led to a significant increase of female non-nationals being shortlisted and also hired. And it's actually, relatively speaking, a very large effect of 41%. However, it's worth saying, you can see the baseline is really low to start with. So it reflects a lot of the reality of not as many female non-nationals being hired in the first place, but we're very happy that at least we pushed it in the direction of hiring more. So before we wrap up, I thought I'd finish off with a few additional findings because these are often questions that come up. They came up for us, so we definitely wanted to look into them. First of all, one question that was important for the firm and for us to know is, what does this reflect? Is it that if you think about non-nationals, maybe I'm very sorry, I probably didn't actually explain this particularly well by not defining it perfectly. So let me just say a non-national is defined in this case if they are applying from one country, from their nationality being in one country, to another country, then that makes them a non-national. It's probably clear, but I just forgot to say that early on. So one worry you might have is this is a European company. Maybe they are hiring, I don't know, I'm from Austria. Maybe they're hiring more Austrians in Germany, right? That's not culturally a big difference, to be honest. And in many ways, probably not what the company had in mind. Similarly, if you're in Canada and you get hired to the US, probably also not what the company had in mind. So when we looked, we found that it was actually global South applicants being more likely to get hired into the global North countries. Very much in line with what the company wanted to try achieve to really get more social mobility, basically, and global movements going in the company. The second thing is we looked at what does it correlate with, and we found that the effects were stronger. So the treatment effect of the diversity condition, they were stronger, bigger in higher income countries and in countries with higher levels of gender equality to start with. And we don't know why that is, but you could speculate that it has something to do with the level of acceptance already around gender equality. In labor markets where it's just not that established, having a diversity training that talks about the benefits of diversity training, of diverse groups and having them part of your organization might just be less resonant with people who are watching this. And lastly, we also looked at the particularly wealthy and gender equal headquarters country and find that a lot of effects are driven by that. So it seems to be particularly and we don't know why that is, but it may be that the company is particularly obviously well represented there and people pay attention to what headquarters says. So it might just be around that as well. What we didn't see, quite importantly, and this is again a question that comes up often, is managers' gender, the hiring manager's gender, whether they were male or female, didn't influence whether it was stronger or less strong in the diversity conditions. So it doesn't seem to be moderated by the manager's gender or their seniority. It seems to work equally well for male and female managers and at different levels of seniority. What we take away from this is that there's probably some variation by country and or cultural context, but we didn't see a moderation by individual factors. So something at the country level or cultural level might be affecting how people view these diversity training that they get, but individual factors didn't seem to matter. All right, so with that, I think I'm going to wrap up here and leave it open for the floor for questions. But I thought I'd left you and hopefully inspire you to think about what's next, right? We want to achieve hopefully good balance in organizations, fair outcomes for people. And I think that we are getting an evidence base now that's much better. It's starting to grow. It's much better than it was a few years ago on how to design fairer workplaces. But I think we still need more interventions on the supply and demand side. And I also think to really get there, we should encourage more RCTs in the real world to generate this kind of causal evidence of what works. Obviously, this is if you need more ideas of what has already worked, then I will recommend Siri and Iris's book again, because it's fantastic and has a lot of the bits in there already. But I also hope that we're going to find more research in this area exactly along those lines. And I'm hoping for organizational leaders, they have seen this and they've seen ways that they can make that work in their own organizations, because we need this evidence in the real world from real outcomes. So with that, thank you very much. And I'm handing back to Siri.
Thank you, Oliver, for that incredible presentation. I will just say we're waiting for you to write a book one day. So that's going to be coming.
Thank
But
you.
thank you for that powerful call to action. The only way we'll generate this increased evidence based from the real world and not just lab studies is if we actually are able to participate and collaborate with organizations. So if there's organizations on the call today who are thinking, we could potentially be a research partner, please do reach out, because that's something that we are always in need of. So thank you, Oliver. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions already. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to type in your question. We do ask that those questions are brief and specific and on topic and are indeed phrased in the form of a question. So Oliver, let's start with a few that have been submitted already. And let's go back to the first study on resumes.
Mhm.
Do you have any additional information on how the effects might have differed depending on the number of years that people actually had spent in jobs? So hypothetically, what if you had someone who had, 10 different experiences of 1 year each? Might that still be helpful for them to list their experience in years, or do we expect to see some differences based on how many years people actually spent in different roles?
That's a great question. Thank you. So two bits on that. And I'm gonna be very careful because it's been a few years, so I'm hopefully not misremembering this. So first of all, we didn't look at this particular idea of what if you had, rather than one job for 10 years, say, what if you had 10 jobs for 1 year, for instance? That's the most extreme case, right? Like, does this sort of matter? Does it matter whether you have 10 years experience, 5 years, or 2 years? It's a related question, right? Like, but then you can sort of imagine that experience over time can sort of outweigh potentially the effects of employment gaps. I would say that we know very little about this. First of all, from the field, I know we haven't done any additional audit experiments to figure it out. So I think call to action, someone should do this. This would be great to find out. Because I think my view is that experience will eventually moderate that, right? Like if you have 20 to 30 years experience, I think that the employment gap, it will lead to different questions. I still think that our intervention might help those people, but I think you won't have the same assumption that we see in this particular range. Now, going back to why we chose this was sort of well calibrated to reflect and calculate. If you add up the number of years, it was a woman who was around 30, 5 years. So in the UK, 3 years in undergrad, so that makes it on average 21 plus 5 years plus 4 years gets you around 30. And that's because it was sort of aimed at the average age in the UK for a first child. Then 2 years, it's I think 18 to 20 months, I think is the average gap for women. So these were all the dates we used based on that. We did actually, so that's why we had the field study on that. So we don't have variation, and I hope someone will check this in the future to see what inferences will people make and how does that affect it. I'll say lastly, in the online experiments, we ran a bunch of different things because we were curious about that as well. I don't remember whether we included it in the paper. Do go back, please, and check. I believe we varied some level of experience, but it was not huge ranges. And I think it was 2 or 5 years. And I don't believe there was a big difference here. But again, that's why it's been a few years. I don't want to get it wrong now. But I do think that the main thing is to take away is that I think the intervention itself seems intuitive for people to get. So I don't see a reason why it wouldn't have generally a positive effect. I do think that there will be some moderators down the line that we find where just the effect will be muted a bit.
Yeah, thank you. And on that note, did you vary the length of the gap? So what if
Mm.
someone had, a 5-year, 10-year gap on their resume, someone who had multiple children, stayed at home while they were all young, and then only was looking to re-enter or did re-enter the workforce once they were all in school, let's say?
Yeah, great question. No, we didn't do that, but there's a bit of work out there that we know of. So labor economists have studied a lot when people do have employment gaps. So there's multiple factors, obviously, but if something is over a certain period of time, it's no longer considered a temporary unemployment, but then permanent.
Mm,
And there's a huge, like a big drop off for people trying to get back into the workforce once they're hitting this multiple year permanent unemployment territory. So we know that employers seem to take a lot, or they see this as a huge signal. So
mm,
that's one finding. However, as far as I know, the studies that I do know are all in the US. Now, I'm contrasting that back to Austria actually as a good example. Austria has extremely um, generous, you might say, maternity protection. It's multiple years. In fact, I think paid for X number of months, maybe a year or two. But then the job that you held at the time when you went into maternity leave is held for you at the employer for up to 7 years for one child. So you could imagine you have multiple children and you add this on. You could be out of work by choice. You don't have to, but it is a cultural norm that women stay home more than probably in the UK and the US. You might find yourself not working for multiple years. Now, on the one hand, I think going back to the studies in the US, it might say that those people with long employment gaps have a hard time getting back in. But then again, in Austria, it's a cultural norm that people do that. So does it work the same way there? A way in the sense that 5 years will be read, 5 years in Austria will be read the same way as 5 years in the US? I don't think so. But again, more research would be needed to understand that.
yeah, that's illuminating. Thank you. And speaks to the important role of the environment and norms. So this study was done in the UK. And Oliver, to confirm, it was across sectors, right? All different types of employers, all different types of roles,
Yep, yep, that's right. Yeah.
and
I mean, obviously
including
we have to
roles
make
of
a
different
choice.
seniority.
Yes, that's right. We aimed at a similar level in general, so we didn't try to go and stretch too far out or too junior. And just because we wanted to be realistic about this, it was a job that was similar to what this person, I'm calling it a person, but remember it's fictional characters, held previously. So these were all sort of transferable. It was not a vertical move, it was seen as more horizontal. And another
Mhm.
reason, by the way, this is not coming from us, this is from previous studies, it's usually that you explain in the cover letter, you move cities as well. That's how you motivate, for instance, why in the no gap condition, someone applies for a new job. You don't want to sound like someone who doesn't like their employer in the same city. you're sort of explaining and we're moving. So all of these things are baked into that, and they're seen more as horizontal moves. It's a good question to ask what happens if you're trying to go really senior. What would that do?
Yeah. How about we have a question here about whether you tested anything else in the resume study, such as varying names from something that sounds very white and stereotypically British, like Sarah Smith, to more ethnic sounding names, for example. Was that part of the study at all?
It wasn't, and part of the reason was we wanted to keep it simple, so to speak. I mean, you can already imagine simple is probably the wrong word. And again, big kudos to Leonie, who did the hard work of monitoring that inbox, because 9,000 resumes, a lot of resumes to send out. If you introduced variation by not gender, by ethnicity on top of that, you might have to double or triple up depending on how many ethnicities you want to look at. That's a really interesting study, but it was out of scope for us. So I think um, I'm wondering a little bit, would we expect to find something dramatically different for the intervention itself? I don't think so. Now, would we find potentially what other studies have found of some sort of discrimination by ethnicity? That may be the case, but would the intervention help to overcome the employment gap that we're trying to deal with? I'm hoping it would. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work for somebody with a non-white name if, the comparison is not ethnicity comparison, but within ethnicity, the control CV where there is a gap available, like obvious, and the years intervention where it's not. I think that will still do better.
Yeah. Let's shift gears and turn to something that you mentioned at the end of describing the second study, but this is more of a universal point, actually, which is people will often argue that the only way we can increase the hiring of women, the promotion of women all the way up to senior leadership, and just generally the presence of women in organizations is by having more women in leadership and decision-making roles in the first place. So it's kind of the chicken and the end is we need more women there, and then they're going to bring more women in with them. And I know you mentioned that for the science diversity training study, we didn't actually see meaningful effects by manager gender. So do you want to comment more broadly on this idea that we need women in order to have more women?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's many ways to think about this, and I think I'm falling somewhere in the middle of like, how do I think about the role model effect, right? So are role models important? I think so. I think there's obviously important studies, and your book mentions them very nicely, right? Like the famous one in India is where you can really see when women were sort of a quota, a better word for it would also be sort of just a rule book about like what would is expected that the representation at the council level should be. When there were more women, it led later to more young girls aspiring to be in those positions. So I think role models are important. Now, is this necessary? I guess another question. I think it can be supportive, but I think we shouldn't see it as the only intervention or the necessary one, without which we couldn't do something else. So I'm thinking of doing, fairness in the workplace has different components and different things we should be doing. So I think role models, having them at a senior level, could help. Should we expect those role models or those, let's say in this case, female decision makers, if we're going to talk about gender, for instance, should we expect them to act dramatically different to their male counterparts?
Mm.
Probably not, because many of them are, if they're that senior, brought up in a similar environment, right? Socialized in a similar way. So to that extent, I'm not surprised that we don't find the kind of moderation by gender, because in many ways, they have lived through often similar, maybe not experiences, but similar times in growing up. And so to some extent, some of those stereotypes may be baked into how they view the world without realizing it, right? Now, of course, you get variation in both directions, right? So it may be the case that we find over time that this shifts both for men and women because culture has shifted in the last few years. So hopefully in the direction that we hope that is more fair. But I also think that there's one last bit about that I want to bring in on like sort of the senior end that I think is important to also think about. And it's a bit more speculative, but a paper I didn't mention today that we looked at was on we looked at board. This is a UK study again because there's a lot of data available at the board level, it turns out, and also the level below board level for listed companies. And what we looked at is whether the introduction of targets, so not a quota in this case, but a target in the UK, it led to an increase in women on board level. This was also where the focus was, a lot of discussion. And that's a big success story, so to speak. So you might think that now that we have women in boards, that and eventually also we found some or other people have found other effects that it was a bit at the executive level, especially those who had board seats. Again, it was linked together. But the question is, what happens at senior leadership level? if it's true that the so-called trickle-down effect is enough, you need people at the very top, you should expect over the years to have all organizations start to populate their senior leadership positions as well with more women. And what we find was a bit disheartening. We found that those organizations that before the introduction of the target for the board level did well on women on boards, they did well on the boards afterwards, so they increased the share. They also increased the number of women in senior leadership. For them, it seemed like it was a cultural question. So they changed not just where it was necessary at the top, but they changed something in the organization to make those women go into senior leadership positions from the bottom up. Those who did really, really badly initially didn't really have women on boards at all, so no real change in the senior leadership. So they seem to treat it more like a token, like, oh, we're going to fulfill this target because everyone's looking, but we're not changing our culture. And again, that goes back to why I think we should just think about, how do senior people, like, is it possible that it can make a difference, but also should we expect them to make those differences for the reasons that I mentioned? I think it needs multiple approaches. It wouldn't be enough to just do one thing.
Just to expect that more women can automatically fix the situation for other women.
Right, exactly
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah.
Let's pivot to talking about the second study, so the diversity training. Could you talk to us more about the difference between the diversity training condition and the effectiveness training? And directionally on the graph, we see that both of them are making a slight difference or a slight improvement compared to the control condition, but it's not statistically significant for the effectiveness training, of course. So how should we think about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as you know, we've thought about this a lot, right? Like, I wish we had like the best answer for this. I think part of me thinks we just need to be the scientists in us, which is we're testing this with our best hypothesis in mind. And they were that we thought both of these conditions have a reasonable shot at working. Now, based on the literature, and especially our co-author, Edward, obviously had done a lot of work around making diversity salient, and that seems to be an effective mechanism. It seemed also to us that that would work better, and it turned out it did. However, I think the fact that the effectiveness condition is somewhere halfway between, even if it's not statistically significant, tells us something else is at work here too. Now, one of the things could be that managers start to just think more consciously about how to assemble their team, right? That is not necessarily that we have to drive home the message about diversity all the time, but it's simply making them more aware to think about this, because the effectiveness condition didn't make diversity front and center, right? We didn't talk about it, but they still had to stop and think. And they were, in fact,
Mhm.
our videos, which I didn't say, they all had a moment of reflection for people to think about what they've just heard from these senior leaders, right? So in both conditions, we had that reflection. Maybe that's important too. If people have previously learned that it is an important thing, that diversity and different perspectives is something that the organization wants, that they might care about them as well, then having any kind of video like this that gives them a chance to make a more conscious decision could already help. But again, it wasn't significant. So we are being more careful in this and not trying to say that the effectiveness condition does work in the same way. But it makes me hopeful that stopping and thinking about it is a direction of travel we should continue more of. And so hopefully in the future, when people test different versions of our diversity training or somebody's diversity training, they start to unpack that, right? And maybe part of it
Mhm.
is that part of the effect is that people need to stop and think about it. It probably won't be the end of the story, but it's certainly something that is in the back of my mind we should be testing more of.
Yeah. And that's actually what we mentioned in the paper too, is in designing the intervention, we sort of threw the kitchen sink of behavioral science at it. And we packed the training with all of these things that we thought might work. It was timely, it was delivered by the senior leaders, it was specific, it had the moment of reflection. But precisely because of that approach, we didn't have a chance to tease out the effect of each of those things individually, which is something that we hope future research will do. And maybe it'll turn out that everything contributes equally, or maybe one of those factors was significantly more important in driving the effects than another. That's such a good point. So, what if we did a combined training where we talk about both diversity and effectiveness? What's,
Mm.
of course, we haven't tested this yet, so this is all kind of projection, right, and conjecture at this point. But do you think we would see essentially exponential effects from throwing both of these two things in together? Is that
It's a
the
good
right way to
question.
think about it?
Yeah, very good question. Part of me would like to think that people pay attention, and yes. But the other part of me thinks, from behavioral science, we know that people's attention spans is limited. And so
Mm.
I think we're going to find it tapers off at some point. Now, Are these two things too much? I'm not so sure, right? Like just adding another element to it is kind of like you said, we did the kitchen sink approach before. So this will be adding another element to it. It doesn't mean that um, it wouldn't work, but I'm not expecting it to go exponentially better. It could shift it up a little bit more, potentially. But I do think that if you keep adding things, the training gets longer again. It becomes less focused,
Mm.
it becomes less targeted at what we want people to do. And suddenly, I think we could see performance go down again of that particular training. So I do think it's a balancing act. Personally, I like the idea of trying this. I mean, if we had had another 5,000 vacancies and I don't know, 100,000 applicants, we could have maybe tried that as well, which is again, a call to organizations. If you're keen to try this, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to find opportunities to test these things because at the moment they are hypotheses, they are untested, but doesn't mean that they wouldn't work. They might work very well, or we might try a different approach now that we have learned certain things from our previous study. So I do think it's a matter of empirical testing before we make a conclusion on this.
And this is often what happens, right? When we run these experiments, is the results answer some questions and
Yeah.
then they raise many others for future investigation,
And part of what
as
I
is
think, and
happening.
completely right, and I think one thing that I often say to people when they look at, for instance, this, because there's been 20 years of AC diversity training not really working, at least from the evidence that's been collected by lots of other researchers, which can make you sort of a bit down if you think about it. But then we have an example that does work. Now, some people are like, great, let's just do that everywhere. And my thinking is, this is an opportunity to learn, right? Like just because it worked in this context with this
Mm.
company, with our approach, which was tailored to the company, I think ideally we go out and we test it more with other companies in their context and making training that seems sensible for them. So rather than seeing it as like the blueprint everyone should adopt, it's a blueprint of how to test it so we can find out what works.
Yeah, so beautifully said. We have time for one more question, which is, did you look at, or did we look at types of jobs in this diversity training study? So what if this company, for example, given that it's a telecommunications and engineering firm, what if it was hiring for overwhelmingly male stereotyped jobs, engineering, product design, science type of stuff? Do we think that has any bearing on the results?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Now, I know that we controlled for job position like function. I don't recall now for each of the functions what the effects were. However, maybe the bigger point, and that's part of the question you just asked, is did it work, especially in cases where it might be tough, right? Where, so to speak, we know the stereotypes might be particularly strong. And the answer is certainly to the extent that we know, yes, because in this company, about 75% of employees are male. And so to the extent that, and this is across all of the functions, right? So there will be some with more male dominated, some fewer. And so that's why I'm saying I don't remember the specific each function, but I do remember across the board it worked very well. So to the extent that I think this works in the challenging cases, yes, I think so. Does it work equally well across the board? I don't remember, and I think would be worth going back and checking again because I think I wouldn't be surprised if there's some variation, but I also think that the scope to make a positive impact is larger in areas where maybe at the moment there is overrepresentation of men. And so I think to some extent, I'm thinking that's where our intervention would have more of a chance to have a bigger effect. I'm hoping so. If not, then I think we should go back and test it.
Yet another opportunity to test. Oliver, that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so very much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing this brilliant work in such an eloquent fashion. We're very, very lucky to have you. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Siri, and thank you again for the invitation.
And we hope you all will join us back again next week for another seminar that you will not want to miss. Next Monday at the same time, we'll be joined by Nick Bloom, who is professor of economics at Stanford University. He will be talking about the themes we cover in Make Work Fair in Chapter 10 regarding workplace norms and arrangements, specifically flexible work. So Professor Bloom will join us to present his research titled The Glorious Future of Working from Home. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day.